Lovely. So, hello everyone. Welcome to this session for support staff and academic staff on open licenses. My name is Beck Pitt. I know I've met some of you at the May workshops in Yangon. I'm based at the Open University and I'm a researcher here. And I'm here with Yin Tan, who's of eTakato at Manchester. And we're going to be talking about open licensing today. So just to remind you again that this session is being recorded, and welcome to everyone that's watching this after the event as well. So today we are going to be covering quite a lot of material. We're going to be taking a look at open licenses, why you might want to use open licenses. We're going to have a recap of Creative Commons open licenses. I know that in May we looked at these then. And then we're also going to look at what are open educational resources. What's the connection between these and open licenses? And then we're going to take a brief look at remixing. And also what we want to hear is your questions. So we've got the chat box here. So if you do have any questions through the webinar or comments, please add them to the chat box and we will come in and answer them. Hello to everyone that's joining us. It's lovely to see you all. So please do share your questions in the chat box. So I wanted to start with a question. There's a couple of questions that I wanted to ask just to get a sense of what you're doing. And I wondered, where do you find resources for your teaching and learning? If anyone wants to share where they would usually go to find resources in the chat box, that would be great. Don't know if people look for them online. Maybe they ask the library. Just to give you a moment to answer that if you want to. Hello to everyone that's joining us as well. It's great to have you here. I can see someone typing, that's great. So I'll just give you a minute. Just if you want to share where you find your resources for teaching and learning. It's quite okay, so I can see someone typing. So it could be that you, I don't know if people look online, if you work with colleagues, you ask colleagues, maybe you share resources that way, through your library maybe, something else. If you do have something that you want to share about that as we go through the webinar, then please do. Oh, sorry. So thank you for highlighting that. Is that a bit better? Am I clearer? Can you hear me a bit better now? Yin, do I sound clear to you? Can you hear me okay?
I am okay with your voice.
Okay, so
Maybe connection issue in Myanmar.
Okay. Does that sound?
You speak a little bit slow, then
Okay.
you might get to compensate the connection line.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me a bit better now? Does that sound better? Okay, Great, thank you. Great, thank you.
So they said that if your voice is getting clear, so maybe a little bit louder.
Okay, great, thank you. And apologies for that. That's okay, great. I'm glad that's a bit clearer. So this question, just really, if anyone does want to share where you find resources for learning and teaching, and then also how you decide on what resources to use. So when you're thinking about resources for learning and teaching, where do you go to find them, and how do you decide what resources you want to use? So if anyone does want to share their thoughts, that would be great. I know people find things from all different kind of places. And have different ways of assessing what's best for their students. Okay, so I'll leave that question there, or those questions, with you for the webinar. And if people do want to share, then please do. We'll move on and kind of look here at what is an open license. So I'm using a definition here from the Open Knowledge Foundation, which says a license is a document that specifies what can or cannot be done with a work. And this can apply to all different kinds of resources. So it says here, whether sound, text, image, or multimedia. It grants permissions and states restrictions. Broadly speaking, an open license is one which grants permission to access, reuse, and redistribute with few or no restrictions. And yet, you're right, there is a connection. I can see in the chat, thanks. There's a connection to open educational resources, and we'll talk a bit about this. So it's the idea of opening up and granting permission to people to do to use a resource in a specific way. And there's lots of different types of open license. You're probably aware of this, depending on the kind of resource that you want to make available. So, for example, software, you might see MIT, GNU, General Public or Apache licenses, for example. So there are a number of different types of open license. But today we're going to talk about Creative Commons licensing. And you already probably be familiar with these from the May workshops. Excuse me. So Creative Commons licenses apply to all different kinds of resources that you might want to use for educational purposes. And they're a NGO, a non-government organisation, a non-profit organisation that was established in 2001. There's 1.4 billion Creative Commons licensed works available in the world at the moment. And Flickr, YouTube and Wikipedia are the top three places, CC license, places that people are finding Creative Commons licensed material. And you can find out more about Creative Commons on the link in this slide. So every year they publish a report called State of the Commons, and you can go to the link there and read more about the impact that Creative Commons has and what they do. And they're an international organisation with 104 chapters across the world, with 30 of these in the Asia Pacific region. So, some of you may remember this slide. So we often, copyright is often described as being an exclusive right into how the work is used and shared. But what Creative Commons does, it gives it some rights reserved. And what this means is it gives you the flexibility, the ability to be more flexible with what rights you grant to others. In other words, the permissions that you give to other people to use the things that you've created. So Creative Commons licenses builds on existing traditional copyright as this slide presents here. And this means that you don't have to ask permission to use something. So copyrighted materials, usually you need to approach the owner of the person who created the resource and ask permission to reproduce it, for example. With Creative Commons licensing, you don't need to do that. There's a clear instruction on what you can do with it, with a resource. And so this has a cost and time-saving benefit. So as you can see here at the bottom, it says it minimizes the transaction costs. You know, you're granting the permissions beforehand. So I think with fair dealing, my understanding in Myanmar is that there's fair dealing under the Copyright Act that's current at the moment. So I know it was quite interesting for me to put this together and see exactly. I know that you've got new copyright law legislation which is currently being considered, being looked at the moment. So that was released in 2015. I've put a link in the bibliography if anyone hasn't already seen that. But obviously at the moment the Copyright Act of 1914 is still stands. So there's kind of changes in copyright law coming, obviously, in Myanmar. So I'm just going to pick up on a couple of comments a minute before we move on. So the November workshop, there will be more detail shortly, just so that you're aware of that. So we will be sharing more details on that very, very soon. Sorry to hear that the internet connection is poor. I hope you can hear me okay. Hello to other people that are joining as well, or have joined since the start. It's great to have you with us. So, Yin, I don't know if you wanted to come in and say anything at this point before I just open it up for people's thoughts about how openly licensed resources might be able to help them. Did you want to say anything, Yin?
Yeah, I just using the comment about I think it depends on where they are. Some people said that the connection is poor, but some people say it is okay to clear and see slides.
Right. Okay.
So it's a bit of mixed message. So is that okay if I talk a little bit?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
ဆရာတို့ဆရာမတို့အခုဘတ်ပြောရတဲ့ဘလောက်ပေါ့နော်မှာဆိုရင်ဒီ open license နဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့ဆရာမတို့မရှင်းတာပါရှိလဲကျွန်တော်တို့ဗာမေးစရာရှိလဲပေါ့နော်နောက်တစ်ခုကဒီဆရာမဒေါက်တာတကင်ဟိုရန်ကုန်အဝေးတင်တက္ကသိုလ်ကမေးထားတဲ့မေးခွန်းက CC license for YUDE အဲ့ဒါဘာလို့ဆိုလိုပါလဲမသိဘူးနည်းနည်းလေးပြန်ရှင်းပြလား Okay, yes, I know him.
So I think a few people are typing, so we'll just give a minute for comments a second before we move on. Okay, so thanks for that question. how do we get Creative Commons license soon? Well, anyone can use a Creative Commons license. They're there for you to license your own work with. If it's work that's produced as part of your work, your job at the university or similar, sometimes your university will have, it might have an agreement that what you produce it belongs to them or the university rather than you. So it's worth checking what your university says about the work that you produce within that context. So some people, so some institutions have a policy, they develop a policy around open educational resources so that people can release things in the open that they produce as part of their job. In terms of registering, so you don't, I might apologies if I misunderstand this. So there's no need to register to use them. Anyone can put a Creative Commons license on their work. So for example, yeah, I take photos and I upload them to Flickr and I put a Creative Commons license on them. And it is internationally applicable. I'm just looking in the chat. So yeah, it is an international license. So the 4.0 version of the license is being designed to all of the licenses, but particularly the 4.0 one has been designed to be applicable to international contexts. So previously, last week we had this question, I'm not sure if it was you or a colleague, who asked about different versions of Creative Commons license. And in earlier versions of the license, it seems that there were a number, you could basically create, there was ported versions of the license, which reflected specific regional copyright. So for example, there's an England and Wales 2.0 license, I think. So 4.0 is designed to be as applicable to international law and to basically mean that, you know, there doesn't need to be ported licenses for this version of that.
I think they need to either you need to expand the 4.0 means because of this different levels. I think they're not familiar with that.
Okay, that's great. Yeah,
it's just a code. So what is in the 4.0? The people can like share, copy,
yeah, that's great. So what we'll do is, that's a great question in the chat box, and what we'll do is hopefully we'll come back and look at that. But first of all, as Yin suggests, we're going to move on in a moment to look at the different parts of the license, just so that everyone is clear about what we mean when we're talking about different components of the license itself. Just before we do that, I wanted to ask people what they thought or how they thought something with an open license might be able to help them. So does anybody have any ideas or thoughts about why you might want to use an openly licensed resource? So please, if you do have any thoughts, share them in the chat box. Just give you a moment to have a think. Okay, that's okay. So there's a number of different ways. We're going to see how openly licensed resources, what they comprise of in a moment. But some of the arguments for using openly licensed resources means you can access resources more easily. So you can share ideas, notes, resources. You can see if people share them on an open license, you can reuse them. There's a nice, it saves time and cost. So we saw earlier, you don't have to ask permission to use something. You can use a resource and potentially modify it if the license allows that. So that enables you to make things specific to your context. So for example, you could translate something into Burmese, you can add local examples if the license permits that. It also means that things can be updated more easily. So if something changes, you can easily modify that, the resource to reflect that. In terms of cost savings for institutions and students, different places around the world have different kind of issues maybe that open resources highlight. So in North America in particular, there's very high textbook costs. And this has been one of the ways in which, so this has really been an important mainstreaming of open educational resources. And there's been a large number of people now using open textbooks with cost savings, significant cost savings. And this, for institutions, is also a good way of encouraging people to come and study, because they can, some places have chosen to make their courses zero cost for the materials that students need to have. So University of Maryland, University College, there's something called the Z degree or the Z cred. There's a number of these kind of things. So yeah, there's some of these are reasons. Also, in other places, say in South Africa, for example, openly licensed resources have provided resources where there were none at all. So Siavula, they make maths and science textbooks, and the government distributed hard copies of the textbooks across Africa, across South Africa. So yeah, really it's about enabling access to education and enabling educators and students to have resources that they can adapt and change and get access. And some very interesting things that people do in terms of using open and licensed resources with students as well to create new things. So, moving on to the licenses themselves, there's 4 components of Creative Commons license, and these 4 elements are as follows. So, the first one is at the top requires you to attribute the resource. So basically needs you to say who created it and provide information about it. And we'll come on in a minute to see what that looks like, what best practice looks like. The second one, which shows an arrow circling inside this circle, is share alike. And this means that the person who created the resource is asking you to share back a modified version. If you choose to change anything, you need to share that back on the same license that it was created on. And we'll talk a bit about Remix shortly, but we will return to it in more detail in the future. The third license element, potential license element, is non-commercial. And this means that if you see this, it means that you can't use the resource within a commercial money-making context. And then finally, no derivatives. And no derivatives means that you cannot change the resource. So this is, we're going to see in a minute why this is important or interesting within the context of OER. But what it means is you can't change the resource. So you have to use the resource, you can share it with people and so on, but you cannot make changes to it. So this is what the 6 different license types look like. going to turn the pointer on a second, so hopefully you can see me pointing to the licenses. So you can see there's different combinations, hopefully. I know for some of you this may be, if you're on a mobile, it may not be so clear, but hopefully you can see these. There's also links in the presentation, so you can have a look at these outside of the webinar. As you can see, the 6 different license types are various combinations of the elements we saw a moment ago. So in the top left-hand side, if you see this license, then someone is asking you to attribute the license, attribute the resource. But it means that you can change it, you can use it in commercial contexts, and so on. You just need to attribute it properly. You can see below that we have the request to attribute and share the resource back on the same license, should you make changes to it. Below that, we have CC by ND. So what this license is asking you to do is to attribute the resource, but it's requesting that you don't make any changes to it. So you cannot change the resource. So for example, add a caption to an image, modify something so it better suits what you want to do with it. You have to keep it exactly as it is. Yeah, great. So that's wonderful. So yes, some of you and Elaine will have also talked about the license types. Moving on to the final 3. So I'm on the top right hand side. This license here is requesting you to attribute, but requesting that you don't use the resource in a commercial context. Below it, we can see this one is asking you not to use the resource. So again, you have to attribute. With all of these, you need to attribute the resource properly. But this one here is saying that you don't use it in a commercial context, and that if you do modify the resource and you share your new version of that, that you do so on this license. And then finally here at the bottom, right hand side, we have CC by NC ND. And this means you need to attribute the resource. You can't use it in a commercial context, and you cannot make any changes to the resource itself. So did anyone have any questions? I'm just going to pause in case anyone had anything that they wanted to comment on at this point. Or Yin, if you want to come in and comment before we move on. Just a moment while people are typing. So I'll just let the comments come. So there's a comment here for Andy Lane as well, so I'll pass that on to him. Anything that you wanted to add in at this point before I move on? Oh, I can hear a voice.
It is from my machine, it is not my wife.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's cool, no worries. Okay, great. Oh, okay.
Okay.
You okay?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Siya map bယ်နေရာလေးtranslate လုပ်ပြရမလဲဘယ် slide ကနေစပြီးလုပ်ပြရမလဲ
license on.
Back, are you okay if I go back to slide number 10?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, please do. Yeah, sure. No worries.
General information. Okay. Okay. So I'll be I think number slide 6ပေါ့နော်နောက်ဖက်ကိုနည်းနည်းပြန်ပြီးတော့သွားလိုက်မယ်ဆိုတော့ creative okay so creative commons license မှာဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ဘာကွာလဲဆိုလို့ရှိရင်သူရဲ့မြင်ရတာမသိဘူးသူရဲ့ဟိုဟာlogo က CC ဆိုပြီးတော့ဖြစ်နေတယ်အဲ့ဒီဟာဘာနဲ့ကွာလဲဆိုရင်ရိုးရိုးစီတစ်ခုပဲဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီကုမ္ပဏီတော်တော်များများမှာတွေ့ရတဲ့ဟာကစီတစ်ခုပဲရှိတယ်အဲ့ဒီဟာဆိုလို့ရှိရင် copyright က all rights ဆိုတဲ့အခါမှာကျွန်တော်တို့အနေနဲ့ကူးယူလို့လည်းမရဘူး copy ကူးလို့လည်းမရဘူးပြန်ပြီးတော့ edit လုပ်လို့လည်းမရဘူး share လုပ်လို့လည်းမရဘူးအဲ့ဒီဟာဒီစီဆိုပြီးတော့ logo နဲ့ဖြစ်နေတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့ Creative Commons license ဆိုလို့ရှိရင် CC ဆိုပြီးတော့နှစ်ခုပေါ်နေတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့တချို့ဟာတွေကိုလုံးလို့မရဘူးတချို့ဟာတွေကိုလုံးလို့ရတယ်ဥပမာအားဖြင့်ပြောရမယ်ဆိုရင်စောနက back ပြောရတဲ့ဟာဥပမာကိုကျွန်တော် example ပေးရမယ်ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ဒီ slide ကိုကြည့်မယ်ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ဘာကွာပါမယ်ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ဟလာ attribute လုပ်လို့ရတယ်ပြီးလို့ရှိရင်ဒီမှာဒီဟိုဟာdollar sign ကို cross လုပ်ထားတာ commercial သုံးမယ်ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်မရဘူး education အလုပ်လုပ်လို့ရှိရင်ရတယ်ဒီ arrow လေးနဲ့ဆို share alike ဆိုတဲ့ဟာဥပမာအားဖြင့်ဆိုရင် resources တစ်ခုကိုဥပမာအားဖြင့်ထားပါတော့ဒီ video တစ်ခုပေါ့နော် science video တစ်ခုကိုဆရာမတို့က online ကနေတွေ့တယ်ကိုယ့်ရဲ့စာသင်ခန်းထဲမှာဒါမှမဟုတ်ဘူးအဝေးတင်မှာပြန်ပြီးတော့ထုတ်ပြမဲ့ဟာဒီမှာပြန်သုံးချင်တယ်ဆိုရင် share alike ကိုလုပ်လို့ရတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့လည်းဘာလုပ်လို့မရဘူးလဲဆိုလို့ရှိရင် no deviation ဆိုတဲ့အခါမှာအဲ့ဒီ video မှာပါနေတဲ့ဟာတွေကိုပြောင်းလို့မရဘူးဒါပေမဲ့အထိုင်းကို share alike လုပ်လို့ရှိရင်တော့ရတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့အဲ့ဒီ video မှာပါတဲ့ပြထားတဲ့ဟာပြောထားတဲ့ဟာတွေကိုပြောင်းကိုမရှိဆိုပြီးပြောထားတာဆိုတဲ့အခါမှာအကြောင်းလို့ဒီဟာကိုကြည့်လို့ရှိရင်ဆောနကကျွန်တော်တို့ပြောတဲ့ဟာဆိုလို့ရှိရင်လူပုံစံလေးပါလို့ရှိရင် attribution အဲ့ဒီဟာပြန်ပြီးတော့ကိုကထည့်ချင်တဲ့ဟာထည့်လို့ရတယ်ထုတ်ချင်တဲ့ဟာထုတ်လို့ရတယ်မလို့ချင်တဲ့ဟာပေါ့နော် share alike ပြန်ပြီးတော့အကြောင်းသားရင်းနဲ့ပြန်ပြီး share လုပ်လာရတယ်ဒါမှမဟုတ်ရင် community နဲ့ share လုပ်လာရတယ်ပြန်ပြီးတော့ license ကိုလည်းမြန်မာပြည်မှာဒါမကဘူး international license ကိုလည်း creative commons license နဲ့လုပ်လို့ဆိုလို့ရှိရင် share alike ပြန်ပြီးတော့လုပ်လို့ရတယ်commercial ဆိုတော့ non commercial ဆိုတာဟာကတနကပြောပြတယ်ဟလာပညာရေးအတွက်သုံးလို့ရမယ်ဒါပြီးမဲ့ထားပါတော့အခုမြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာရှိတဲ့private ကျောင်းတွေဆိုလို့ရှိရင်เนาะဒါစီးပွားရေးအတွက်ဖြစ်တဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်မလို့ commercial အတွက်သုံးမယ်ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်เนาะအသုံးပြုလို့မရဘူးပြီးရဲ့အခါမှာ no deviation ဆိုတာဟာဟလာဘာခေါ်မလဲcontent ကိုပြောင်းလို့မရဘူးဆိုတဲ့ဟာပြီးတော့အဲ့ဆိုတဲ့ဟာကျတော့ဒီမှာ6ခုရှိရ Creative Commons မှာဆိုတဲ့အခါမှာကျွန်တော်ကပြောထားတဲ့ computer တွေအတိုင်းဥပမာဆိုရင်ဒါ Creative Commons ဒါဆိုလို့ရှိရင် attribute လုပ်လို့ရတယ်ဒါဒီအောက်ကဟာဆိုလို့ရှိရင် attribute လုပ်လို့ရတယ် share alike လုပ်လို့ရတယ်ဆိုပြီးတော့ဒီမှာဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ဒီCreative Commons မှာဆိုလို့ရှိရင် license 6 6မျိုးရှိတယ်ဆိုတော့အခါမှာကိုကresources တစ်ခုကိုonline မှာတွေ့တယ်ဟလာ textbook ပဲဖြစ်ဖြစ်ဟလာ video ပဲဖြစ်ဖြစ်ဒါမှမဟုတ်လဲresearch paper ပဲဖြစ်ဖြစ်တစ်ခုတွေ့ရဆိုလို့ရှိရင်သူတို့ license ကဘယ်လိုမျိုးလဲဆိုတာကြည့်လို့ရတယ်ကြည့်ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာကိုကသင်ခန်းစာလေးမှာပြန်ပြီးသုံးလို့ရမလားမရဘူးလားဆိုတဲ့ဟာလေးချင့်ချင်လို့ရတယ်ပြီးလို့ရှိရင်ကိုကပြင်တင်လိုက်တဲ့ဟာတွေလည်းပြန်ပြီး share alike လုပ်တာဘယ်လိုလုပ်လဲ license ကိုလည်းဘယ်လိုပြန်ပေးမလဲဆိုတဲ့ဟာကိုလည်းပြန်စဉ်းစားလို့ရတယ်အဆင်ပြေတာမရှိဘူး I think you will be fine.
Thank you, Yin. That's good. Thanks so much, Yin. That's fantastic. Are you okay for me to move on now?
I think so.
Yeah, is that okay? Thank you so much for translating. That's wonderful. I really appreciate that. So this is familiar, I'm sure, from May's workshop if you're in the support staff workshops. When you're attributing a resource, you need to remember to include 4 things, and it's usually referred to as TASL, which is the title, the author, the source, and the license. So these are the things that you need to remember for the best practice to give the best possible attribution is to include these 4 things. And what this looks like is, there's an example, you can find it on the link here, but most importantly, this is an attribution of this image here. So what you can see, I'll just turn my pointer on a second, is the title, which we can see here, Creative Commons 10th birthday celebration. We also have the source. As you can see, the text is in blue. It's hyperlinked, which means if you click on it and you go to the web page where it is, which is the original Flickr page, you can see the author details included here, and then also the link to the Creative Commons license. So when you're including this this picture, for anyone that sees that they know exactly where the resource came from and what license it's under. So this is a kind of ideal or best practice for attributing. And one thing, oops, and it's also really useful to keep a track of what you're finding when you're looking for things online. In 2 weeks' time, Yin and I will be, the next webinar for support staff will be on finding and evaluating OER, and we're going to be talking more about where to find OER then. But we mentioned last week, it's really important to write down and keep a track of the resources that you're using. And I know many of you are working your way through the course, How to Make an Open Online Course. There's a section there called Managing Open Assets, and there's an asset log, or there's some suggestions for things that you might want to keep a record of. So we've created an example on Google Drive that you can use. So when I share the slides after the webinar, you should be able to find that easily. but just in case, there is some help out there for attributing. So there's a browser add-on called Open Attribute, which will help you attribute things correctly. Likewise, Open Attribution Builder is useful for helping you build up an attribution. And then also, if you want to find out more about best practice, there's a Creative Commons wiki guide to that as well. So there's links on the slide here. Also, I thought it'd be useful because sometimes we find things and we download them and keep them, and you forget where they were. There's ways of kind of finding images again. So there's a couple of links to resources and information here on something called reverse image search. So you can search for images using this reverse image search via Google, and then also from your phone. So there's instructions on how to kind of do that. So that might be useful sometimes if you're looking or trying to find where something came from. Okay, so I'm just going to pause for a minute and see if anyone's got anything that they want to share. I can see somebody's typing. That's great. So yeah, lots of thanks to Yin, and yeah, thank you, Yin. It's really useful. So that's great. I don't think, if there are any questions, please do ask them, although we will have a chance to do that at the end. So open educational resources are a type of openly licensed resource. So this is the UNESCO definition of OER, and it refers to, OER can be any type of educational material. So that could be curricula, could be your notes, could be textbooks, audio, video, anything. And as it says here, the nature of these open materials means that anyone can legally and freely copy, use, adapt, and reshare them. Now this is important. So we've seen Creative Commons licensing, and we're going to take a look at a moment in what this kind of means in relation to the licenses that we've seen a moment ago. So one way in which OER is often referred to by the use of something called the 5 R's. So this is, and these are used to describe the kind of rights in a way that OER gives you. And these were kind of created, this definition was worked up by David Wiley. Originally it was 4 R's, but then a few years ago, David introduced the idea of also retaining the right to keep a copy of a resource, which is particularly important within the context of resources that are only available for a set period of time. So OER gives you permission to retain a copy of the resource, to reuse it, to revise it, to remix it. So that means to create something new from the resource, and also to redistribute it, to share it with other people. So in terms of open licenses, we can kind of see that open licenses give us a range of different permissions, and some of these you can describe as being open educational resources, and some of them not. And I don't know if anyone wants to say why they think that might be the case, if anyone's got any thoughts about why that might be they wanted to share. I can see someone typing. So this is a kind of, here, this is a kind of ordering of the license types from the most free or the most open to, so you can see public domain at the top there, and then the least free at the bottom. Just going to see if there's any comments a second. Okay, so okay, that's great. So I don't think anyone's okay, no, that's fine. So if you look at the two, sorry, I'll turn my pointer on a second. So here we've got, you can see here the two licenses that are described as not being two license types, which are described as not being open educational resource, or not something that would that a resource would be described as an OER. Both contain the no derivatives license. So if you think about before, the 5 Rs are kind of saying that you can remix and revise a resource. So again, with UNESCO, the UNESCO definition, so this is one of a number of different definitions of OER, but they're fairly, they're quite similar. And they're talking about freely copying, using, adapting, and resharing. And so with the no derivatives license, you cannot change the resource. You can share it with people, you know, but you cannot change it in any way. So this is why these resources with this type of license on them are not really considered to be open educational resources. So there's another diagram which I thought might be useful to share here, which also explains this. So as you can see again, here we have the kind of all rights reserved at the bottom, and then we have the two no derivatives licenses here in the yellow, where they're permitting you to share them, some within commercial context. So the CC by ND permits you to share it within a commercial context, but obviously the license below it here does not. Whereas the other license types allow you to change the resource, to make changes to the resource. So hopefully, excuse me, hopefully that's a kind of useful contextualization of open licenses, or this particular type of open license and OER. So I just wanted to briefly, we're going to be talking more about Remix in another webinar. So I just wanted to really quickly introduce this, these two resources that some of you might find useful if you are thinking about remixing, because obviously some license types are not compatible with others. So this table shows you what you can remix. I'm not going to go through it now. I'm just going to leave it there as a useful resource that some of you might want to look at. So for example, this will help you understand what licenses, what things that you can create new things from. There's also an adapters license chart, and all of these resources, you can see on the right hand side here, there's links to more information about these. So this one here is if you make an adaptation of a resource. So if you change, if you're given permission to change something, you need to keep the relicensing of that resource. You need to keep it, it's in the spirit of the original license, so how someone originally kind of shared something, you know, and you need to kind of respect that when you're relicensing it. So this kind of chart's been devised to kind of help people do that. I've put a kind of key, it's not a very good key, but there's further instructions on the link. So basically, in yellow, I think this is kind of telling you that you might want to consider a different way of licensing something. So for example, the status of an original work, which is CC by non-commercial, it probably would not be good practice for you to relicense that on a CC BY license, because somebody has asked or requested that what they are producing is not used in a commercial context. So for you, you could do it, but it wouldn't really be best practice. So this will kind of help you when you do start to remix and revise materials to think about licensing. But we'll be talking about this more in another webinar. So, Yin, I don't know if you wanted to say anything or come in at this point at all on anything. Or if anyone has any.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna, so that's kind of what we wanted to cover today, and now it's really open to everyone for questions or